I'm Maya MacGuineas. I run the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the Campaign to Fix the Debt. And thank you very much, all of you, for turning out for a well-attended event this morning on tax policy in the campaigns and the fiscal implications. It's great to see a lot of the policy wonks from the DC community here today. In many ways, I think this is a really overdue conversation. This is quite an election we're having. And one of the things is that, as somebody who's been working in this field, in the area of fiscal policy for quite some time, there are a lot of I have never seen anything like this before moments. Both all the political stuff that we're all watching, but also I actually don't recall a campaign where there have been so many detailed policies that affect the bottom line of the country, the economy, the budget. And unfortunately, from our perspective, I also don't remember a campaign in recent memory where there have been so many policies that are honestly quite, in our opinion, out of touch with the fiscal realities that we're facing as a country. Right now, the country has deficits that have come down, but we do have record levels of debt. And we have debt that's projected to grow in an unsustainable level, growing faster than the economy going forward. So one of the things the next president is going to have to deal with, whoever he or she is they're going to have to deal with projections of an unsustainable debt, an aging population, and a lot of unmet needs in this country. So I think it's really tremendous that we're seeing so many policy ideas that are being put forth, but I think it's very troubling that during a national election, where it's a great time to have a national discussion on the priorities of a country, so many of the policies we're seeing would actually greatly deteriorate the fiscal situation, worsen the bottom line. Now, the campaign's still early. A lot more is going to continue to happen. So one of the things we're doing at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, we are running a big program called Fiscal Fact-Check. What this is we are analyzing the candidates' policies, their effects on the budget, their effects also on some of the other parts of the policies, depending on what the policies are, but looking at all aspects of them. And this will continue throughout the election, and we assume candidates will continue to offer more and more policies. Often what we see is candidates like to offer the easy policies first and hopefully come up with the more difficult pay-fors or tough choices later on, sometimes after they get out of the primary. One of the things we're trying to do is encourage them to do that. But what we're here to do today is discuss the different tax models that are out there and the different tax policies that have been put forward so far. And I'm really thrilled to be pulling together this event because we have 3 institutions that are coming today who have done just incredible work on modeling the candidates' tax policies. It's very challenging to do. There are a whole lot of different assumptions. Again, there's more detail that's been put forth in the tax plans this year than normal, and many interesting ideas. But it is a huge undertaking to do this modeling, and I think an incredible service has been put forth by these organizations. It's also really interesting to have different organizations doing the modeling because, as I said, there are many assumptions. We get to see the assumptions they're using, why. A lot of times there's no right or wrong, but it helps very, very important discussions get started in the tax community and the broader budget community. So thanks to all of these organizations for the work that you're doing. Thanks for coming today. Our moderator is one of, in my opinion, the absolute best journalists in this whole area. So Jeanne Sahadi works at CNN Money. She has been covering budget, economics, finance for quite some time. And really, I recommend you read her stories because you get more detail, you get more nuance, and you get tremendous coverage. So we're very glad she's been one of our favorite moderators for events in the past. Thank you for joining us today. Come on up.
Oh, you want me to? I'm going to sit here.
Stay there. In
I'm
fact,
don't
stay there. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
That's okay. So Maya's exactly right. This is a big piece of the country's brain trust in terms of understanding tax policy and the implications of tax proposals. And they don't usually get together very often. So this is pretty interesting. Just in terms of the structure, I'm going to introduce them. Each of the panelists will offer their take on a piece of the candidates' proposals. We'll talk about their models. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then I'll toss to people in the audience for your questions, and there are mics that will be coming around, so please wait for those. But first, the introductions, a crib note version. To my right is Len Berman. He's the director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, which he co-founded in 2002. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he is this is the longest title ever, the Paul Volcker Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University, but his students come to Washington. He doesn't go to them.
I think your time is up.
Is it? He's also, prior to this, earlier in his career, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis at the Treasury, and he was a Senior Analyst at the CBO. He's the co-author with Joe Slemrod of Taxes in America, What Everyone Needs to Know, and he also wrote The Labyrinth of Capital Gains Tax Policy, a guide for the perplexed. So he talks to people like me. Next to him is Bob McIntyre, who's the director of the Citizens for Tax Justice. CTJ is a research and advocacy group that fights for tax fairness at the federal, state, and local levels. The group is both widely known here on Capitol Hill, but frankly across the country as the, quote, average taxpayer's voice in Washington. They've also done a lot of work on doing reports on how large corporations parking their profits offshore tend to save a ton in taxes. They're not a fan of that. Bob started working on tax reform in 1976 and has written hundreds of articles on tax policy issues in the Post, the New York Times, the New Republic, and other publications. He's also wrote the column The Taxonomists at the American Prospect. Bob is often an advisor to government officials, both informally and before Congress in testimony. Lastly, Kyle, I've lost the page. I'm so sorry. Lastly, to the far right, we have Kyle Pomerleau. He's the Director of Federal Projects at the Tax Foundation. His research focuses on corporate and business taxation, international taxes, and income taxes. He was the principal architect of the Tax Foundation's International Tax Competitiveness Index, and he led the team at the Tax Foundation this year in analyzing the presidential candidates' plans. And the Tax Foundation was consulted by some campaigns when they were coming up with their plans to kind of run the numbers through their model just to see where things were going to come out before putting it out to the public. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Fox Business News, Time, Forbes, and Bloomberg, among others. Whew. Okay, so now we're going to ask Len to give you sort of a brief overview of the candidates' tax plans as they are, the sort of key elements. Bob is going to follow with a discussion of the distributional effects, who wins, who loses, or who wins and how big. And Kyle is going to talk about the economic growth aspects. So I'm going to just turn to Len briefly to do that.
Excuse me, I wonder if they could use the podium. I think it would, since it's hooked up.
Okay. Would you like to use the podium? Unless he's
all at attention more.
Oh.
I think you should stand up, Len.
Okay. Okay.
The mic doesn't work because it doesn't go high enough for me. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to Maya, who does incredible work. As someone who scared myself and by writing an article called Catastrophic Budget Failure, I'm glad that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget is reminding people that things can go very badly wrong if we don't pay attention. It's also a great pleasure to be on this panel with Bob McIntyre, who is the Dean of the Washington Tax Modeling Community, and Kyle Pomerleau, who's a rising star. And I think the reward for the work that we're doing, and by the way, all the hard work for our plans is done by people on my staff. I'm just a talking head. But the reward for all the work is that we have a really, really interesting set of tax proposals. And I really urge you to pay attention to tax, because if you pay attention to the other parts of the campaign, you'll get really depressed. I shouldn't have said that. There are four radical proposals, and one which is basically a continuation of the status quo with some new proposals, but nothing really that looks radical or different. For the Republicans, no surprise, they all have tax cuts, pretty big ones, and they're all promising spending cuts to offset them, but are not specific about what they are. And as CRFB has pointed out, the biggest tax cut, Donald Trump's, they've actually ruled out the biggest areas where they could cut spending, which is on the mandatory side. The Democrats have tax increases. Hillary Clinton has a small one, and her plan is being released in installments, so we don't even know what the net tax change is going to be. She's promising a middle-class tax cut coming. Bernie Sanders proposes a really big tax increase, and he argues that government's going to provide a lot more services, and people should be willing to pay for it. And most of the tax increase falls on high-income people, but some of it actually falls on the rest on all taxpayers, including those with fairly moderate incomes. The Republicans are obsessed with tax rate cuts. The Democrats want to raise tax rates at the top, and Sanders would raise them by a lot. Secretary Clinton by relatively less. There are new taxes that haven't been proposed before by major party candidates. Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz have consumption tax plans. Marco Rubio would basically replace the income tax with a thing that economists have been interested in for a long time called the X tax. It's a progressive consumption tax. Ted Cruz proposes a value-added tax, which he insists is not a value-added tax, and a 10% income tax, but most individuals would be exempt from that because there are giant subsidies for savings accounts. Senator Sanders proposes a financial transaction tax and a carbon tax, and Senator Clinton proposes a tax on flash traders, on high-frequency traders. On the international side, there are differences. Rubio and Cruz basically say that foreign income shouldn't be, of multinational companies shouldn't be subject to U.S. tax. Trump and Sanders Trump and Sanders both have a worldwide taxation system, although Trump's is at very, very low tax rates. And they all have anti-inversion provisions designed on the Democratic side, plus Trump, designed to prevent companies from moving their headquarters overseas. There are targeted subsidies in some of the plans. Marco Rubio has a very kid-friendly plan. There are child tax credits and credits for paid family leave. Secretary Clinton has credits for worker training, apprenticeships, high health care costs, care for elderly relatives. The biggest loophole, which kind of sounds like a reality television program, goes to Donald Trump, who would have a 15% tax rate on business income, 25% tax rate on other income, which would encourage almost everybody in this room to become a business. We didn't actually score. We assumed that there would be anti-abuse provisions that would prevent that from happening, although we can't figure out what those might be. But if they don't work, the revenue costs will be even bigger. In terms of simplification, all but Secretary Clinton would repeal the alternative minimum tax. Secretary Clinton actually doubles down. She actually creates 3 new minimum taxes: a Buffett rule, 30% tax, minimum tax on income, a 28% limit on the value of deductions, and a 4% surtax, which actually looks a lot like the original minimum tax in the US. One interesting thing is that if you think about the last presidential debate, where there was a big issue about the 47% who don't pay income tax, is that all of the Republicans would increase the number of people who owe no income tax. So obviously their perception of the politics has changed since last time. Senator Sanders would increase the number who owe income tax. And then finally, on the issue of what it would do to whether these things are fiscally responsible, there's just a lot of magical thinking going on. On the Republican side, they all have very, very large tax cuts before accounting for the macro effects. And by the way, there's a handout which has the Tax Policy Center's estimates. They range from $6.8 trillion over 10 years to $9.5 trillion. 6.8 is Rubio and 9.5 is Trump. And advocates argue that, one, they would be able to cut spending by a lot, and second, that there'd be large macroeconomic responses, large positive macro feedback effects. Our view is that it would be really hard to cut the spending by the amount that they're suggesting, and that if the deficit increased by that much, that it could be really damaging to the economy. And I think that's the way the Joint Committee on Taxation would score it. On the Democratic side, the question is, what would the effects be on economic incentives, and would that put a drag on the economy? Sanders says that his new plans would actually boost economic growth by investing in infrastructure and providing free health care, but they would raise marginal tax rates very significantly, and if supply side effects are important, that those could create an impediment. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Bob McIntyre.
Len didn't talk too much about the difficulty in evaluating the cost and distribution of these tax plans. He gave you a nice summary, though, of what they're about. My favorite one that was the hardest was Ted Cruz. He leads off with the following statement: "I will abolish the IRS." Now, that seemed to me to be a very easy plan to estimate the effects of. But I relented and ignored this and decided he was just going to rename the IRS. I have some other significant differences on Ted Cruz with the other two people here, but I want to get right to my main point, which is I think that distributional tables that have been put out by some of the people here, including occasionally my staff, who I've criticized, are totally misleading and tell the wrong story. Imagine, if you will, that someone proposed, a politician say, to abolish the Social Security system and eliminate all the Social Security payroll taxes. And some bright person at a think tank says, well, I'm going to evaluate this plan. And I find that everybody would get a tax cut. Whoopee! And somebody might ask, maybe a human being, what about the benefits of Social Security? And that person, the analyst, might say, well, we don't consider the spending side. Well, I'll give you a real-world example. Suppose someone, a politician, possibly one running for president, made a proposal to provide universal health care to all Americans, get rid of employer-paid and replace it with universal care. Make Medicare for all, so you don't have people in the Medicaid system with doctors not taking them, so forth. It's a wonderful plan. Canada does it. We don't know if it would work in the United States given our orneriness, but nevertheless, that's the plan. And to pay for it, he has taxes, largely on the very wealthy people, but also one of the biggest taxes, maybe the biggest, a payroll tax on employers. So, how do you evaluate this? Well, let's see. What happens to workers who are, well, if you have a tax model, like we do, like they do, you can look at it and you can say, well, let's see. That payroll tax on the workers will be on the employers will be passed on to the workers. On the other hand, if you believe that, I do believe it, then the cost of employer-paid health care will no longer exist, and that saving will be passed on to the workers. Well, it turns out employer health care costs a lot more than a 6.2% payroll tax. So workers end up with higher wages. But they still have the best health insurance, better than they have now, if not the same. So, when you evaluate this plan, what do you say? Are workers better off or worse off to have more money in their pockets and still have better or the same health care? Well, my conclusion was, I thought they were better off. The conclusion of people who only look at the tax side say, well, you know, they're going to have to pay this 6% tax, and then when their wages when their health care benefits turn into wages, they're going to have to pay tax on that, and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, if you only look at taxes, everybody in the country loses. Now, this is a big difference between me and them. I'm in the everybody, except for the rich, wins, and they've got everybody losing. One of us is wrong. Let me give you another example. Let's take the three leading Republican plans, all of which cost, you know, somewhere in the vicinity of $10 trillion over a decade. They have not proposed how they will pay for those. However, we do have a little history. We know what happens when the government passes gigantic tax cuts. Eventually, spending is cut and taxes are increased to pay for it. Under Reagan, that was a really interesting one. He cuts taxes like crazy in 1981 and raised taxes every year afterwards. That was pretty quick. Not that he solved the problem. Bill Clinton solved the problem when it was finally finished in '93. And meanwhile, while he's raising taxes to offset his own tax cuts, he's also cutting Social Security by about 30% in the Greenspan in 1983. Now that was phased in slowly, so maybe nobody noticed, but 30% cut in Social Security. So yes. So what we decided to do is look at the tax effects of the Republican plans, and distributionally and generally revenue-wise, we get similar answers to what the tax policy center gets. But we added to that, paying for the tax cuts. And it's a little paper we handed out today that we put out yesterday. And how are they going to pay for it? Well, I believe when you ask them, they say, I don't know. But we don't know either, of course. But we can make some reasonable assumptions. Half with spending cuts, half with tax increases. It might not be that good, but that's a reasonable place to start. So that's what we did. We assigned paying for the cost of the $1 trillion a year tax cuts, half to spending cuts, and half to tax increases. And what do we find out? Does everybody win under Ted Cruz? Does everybody win under Marco Rubio? Does everybody win under Donald Trump? No. Everybody, but the very richest people, loses. Now, this is a serious difference among us. And I think I'm right. And I think they're totally wrong. I think that it's sort of a half-baked thing. And, I think if we put tables in the newspaper, even if, and Len is very nice about this, he caveats in his nice papers, and he says, well, spending cuts, they might, that might take some of this back from some of the people here on the Republican plans. That's an excellent thing. I've done that myself. In fact, I tried to put it when one of my staff insisted I put out a half-baked distribution table a few months ago. I wrote at the bottom of the table, this table is totally misleading. Well, I eventually figured out a way. I didn't actually figure out a way. I had done it before under George W. Bush. I just forgot in a senior moment that I actually knew how to do this already. Anyway, so there'll be a lot of questions and things. We have differences. These guys think of value-added taxes on producers. I think it's on customers. It makes a big difference. But the big issue is we've got to get the newspapers to start reporting the full story of what these Republican tax cuts are about, and Bernie Sanders tax cuts, because right now they've got both of them exactly backwards.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Kyle's going to talk about the economic growth
Other than that, I
effects.
love your stuff.
Thanks for having me. So I think generally, so far the narrative on a lot of these tax plans or fiscal plans in general have been just the sheer size of them. The Republicans, they paired a lot of structural changes with really, really big rate reductions, and they get these big tax cuts. And again, it's also been an interesting narrative that what they're promising on the tax side isn't really matching up with what they're talking about on the spending side. And while some of these plans have their shortcomings, they do give us an interesting opportunity to discuss tax policy in a way we haven't before, and how we could work in the future to improve the tax system of the United States. So let's just put aside right now the revenue impacts of this stuff and just focus on what the goal of tax reform should be. So the U.S. tax code right now is sort of a sad combination of high marginal tax rates and pretty narrow base due to a lot of itemized deductions or tax credits. In addition, there are a lot of biases in the code. For example, lengthy asset lives in the corporate code create a distinct bias against new investment. The high marginal tax rate on corporate income encourages profit shifting to some degree. And a lot of issues on the individual code, marriage penalties, and stuff like that. So I think the goal of tax reform should be to improve the tax system or the way the United States raises revenue. And if we do that, we'll see economic growth in the long run. And I think that a lot of the presidential plans show us that there are provisions, specific provisions that could be part of tax reform going forward. For example, Len talked about Rubio's plan. He proposed a sort of this full-blown X tax or a progressive consumption tax, which would basically eliminate the current code's bias against future consumption or saving. Cruz and Rand Paul, whether they like to admit it or not, proposed a subtraction method value-added tax, they would eliminate the corporate tax at the same time, which would do away with a lot of the biases there. Jeb Bush, before, of course, he dropped out, he had proposals that had a few interesting proposals that would improve the tax code. He had the ability for secondary earners to file as singles, removing this big marriage penalty. And he also, a lot of the plans, including Jeb's, had this proposal called the interest flip, in which businesses would no longer be able to deduct interest as a way to sort of equalize the treatment between equity and debt finance. And it's also worth noting that all the Republicans, except for Donald Trump, proposed full expensing of capital investment, which basically, as a structural change, eliminates the bias against new investment at the corporate level, a very important proposal that would lead to more investment in the future. And on the Democratic side, there are a lot of base broadening stuff that we've seen before and that actually crosses the partisan divide. Clinton proposed a cap on the value of itemized deductions. This is something that's been in a lot of the Republican plans, of course. And Sanders as well had sort of this cap, but it's more of a surtax where you're above a certain amount. You no longer can have itemized deductions. So, and we've seen this before. Obama has it, or Obama has the Clinton version. Bernie Sanders goes a little bit further. And so just generally, because these plans are very large, there's a tendency to write them off completely that, these people don't know what they're talking about. And I think to some degree there is a disconnect between spending and in the amount of tax revenue. But I think many of the proposals we've seen could easily be part of fundamental tax reform. And as Capitol Hill starts talking about this going forward, I think that's where the focus should be. A lot of these structural changes that both Republicans, Democrats have put forth that could be part of fixing the way the U.S. tax code raises revenue and could provide in the future for economic growth. And I think that's what the goal of tax reform should be in general.
Thank you. So before we get into too much Q&A, you can see that there are differences in how they interpret these plans and the conclusions they draw, and a lot of that is because the models they use are different. So I was hoping you could each talk a little bit about the models you use, what you focus.
Can I respond to what Bob said first?
Oh, this is like the presidential debate. I can't let that go unanswered. Len would like to respond to Bob first, but then they're going to talk about their models. Go ahead.
So my friend Bob had kind of a scathing critique that the Tax Policy Center looked at the tax provisions in Senator Sanders' plan. I mean, there are two things the government does, is it raises revenue and it spends it. And the question is whether there's value in looking at the way the government raises the revenue, separate from the spending part. And as a practical matter, modeling the effects of the Medicare for all, universal higher education, the other things in Sanders' plan, is beyond our current capabilities. I mean, how much is free health care worth you have to compare the value of that to the value of health insurance that's offered by employers. You have to compare it to Medicaid, which low-income people are currently getting, and other things. And we decided that focusing on the way the tax changes would affect the economy overall. We did not interpret this as a slam on Sanders, but basically it was just this is what the tax system would look like under this plan. And we thought that voters and others would be smart enough to figure out whether they thought this would be worth paying for or not. And
that was your fundamental error.
I should also say that we are currently building a model of taxes and spending together, but it's a major undertaking. And for the 2020 campaign, we'll be ready to look at everything, but it is really challenging.
Well, I agree, but in the case of Sanders, even if you just assumed that they'll still have health insurance, which they would. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to get into the entire plan on health care. Just say the workers still have health insurance at least as good as they have now. If they're at General Motors, it'll be the same. If they're at Walmart, it'll be way better. But they'll still have health insurance. Then how can you put out a table, and I know you caveat it all over the place, that tells the general public, who aren't that smart, that everybody loses under Sanders.
We're not saying everybody loses. We're saying this is how the tax system would change.
Well,
we think that there's some value to that.
Well, I think there's a value, but I would put a minus sign in front of it.
But Bob, can I ask you a question? The way CTJ models Sanders' plan, you are making assumptions about the spending side, that workers would benefit that have insurance just as good or better than what they've got today. But is that part of your model, or is that your political assessment or your sensible judgment?
Well, I believed Sanders when he said that that was true. It's interesting that I believed Sanders about that and didn't believe Cruz about abolishing the IRS, but I did believe Sanders. He seems a little more truthful to me. So that was the basic assumption, and then everything else followed. I mean, just to model the various taxes, you have to figure out how much employees' wages are going to go up, taxable wages, and a little bit of arithmetic going on there.
They all agree with that.
And so everybody, I think everybody here agrees that workers' wages will go up, and they will go up by more than the taxes they will pay for most people.
Do you both agree with
Yeah,
that? Okay.
and yet, the workers' wages go up, and you only count the taxes they pay. Now that is bizarre.
Well, so, I mean, there's also just a question
It
about...
makes me crazy.
Yeah, I know. But that was a short trip for you.
Thank you, Len.
But, I mean, there's a question about whether we model Sanders in a completely different way from the way we model all the other plans.
Well, I
Yeah.
would suggest the other plans, you probably ought to at least suggest that when you take account of how these tax cuts are paid for, that the chart that shows everybody wins is a little bit misleading.
Again, so the Tax Policy Center tried to fill in some blanks on on Governor Romney's plan in 2012, and we got mugged for making assumptions that weren't consistent with what the candidate was proposing. We talked about we talked to people who were advocates for some of the Republicans, and they said, well, they're going to raise taxes, they're going to cut spending in a way that's very, very progressive. I'm skeptical of that, right?
Yes.
But it's how do we know the distribution of the change in
We don't.
change
But we
in
know
spending?
that no matter how you figure it, it's going to be bad.
So can I just pivot off of that to get to growth? If you want to look at Sanders' plan and count the spending aspects of it, offsetting the tax increases, would you take it one step further then and measure the economic growth effects as the Tax Foundation does? I mean, is the obligation, shouldn't it extend to the economic growth?
I would be happy to measure the economic growth effects. Here's my experience in 40-some years doing this. It doesn't matter.
The economic growth effects don't
No,
matter?
no, economic growth is an excellent thing. But I'll give you an example. Reagan in 1981 passed this gigantic corporate tax cut, gave them everything they wanted, super accelerated depreciation, more for the oils, everybody, and investment went down the toilet. I'm quoting Greg Palatine from the Reagan administration. And then we closed a lot of the Reagan loopholes over the next few years, culminating in 1986, and investment went gangbusters. So I'm not saying that incentives that they hurt investment necessarily, although they do probably get wrong investments made in a lot of cases. But they don't seem to help. And you can look at history like this all through the years. And you don't see that these things make a good thing. The Kennedy administration put in an investment tax credit in the 60s. They eventually learned to hate it and repealed it because it was doing all the wrong things and it cost too much. Even business didn't like it at the time. So yeah, I think the economic effects ought to be taken into account. There will be some losses if you misdirect investment, but other than that, no.
Is
It's
that,
just not worth measuring.
it's not worth measuring?
No,
Okay,
because
so-
it's too trivial.
okay, I think Kyle disagrees.
I know. Kyle's going to make the same argument that Arthur Laffer and his crowd made back in 1981. It didn't work out. It didn't work out for Kansas, and
Can I
not working out for Louisiana, and
Can I just extrapolate a little bit? Is part of your point that tax reform is good for a lot of things, but its effects on economic growth might be trumped by other, I'm so sorry to use that word, but might be overridden by other factors, so that just measuring economic
absolutely, yeah.
effects?
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
I would like a simpler tax system that had less distortions in it. We're all on the same page on that one.
Okay.
But I'm not going to predict that we're going to save the economy with it. We're just going to have something that makes more sense.
Okay.
And that is fairer between different individuals and things like that.
Okay. Kyle, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about how the Tax Foundation has a different view on that?
Yeah, so it is certainly a challenge to measure how tax plans in the past have impacted the economy overall. There are lots of moving pieces there. But the way we look at it and the way our model looks at it is, or I can just go into a little bit of how our dynamic model works. So our model is a long-run model, so it looks at the output of the economy as a function of two inputs, labor and capital. And the amount of labor and capital determines the long-run output of GDP. So a little bit more labor, a little bit more capital, and GDP will be higher in the long run. So where does tax policy fit in there? Tax policy fits in where marginal tax rates on labor, increase those or decrease those, that's going to change the quantity there. And for capital, change the service price of capital, and that's going to impact the amount of investment going forward. So economists look at this stuff, and I think the EITC is a good example of this. So why is there this bipartisan support of the Earned Income Tax Credit? Well, the phase-in, which creates these negative marginal tax rates, is a reduction in marginal tax rates. And this encourages labor force participation, and that increases the amount of labor and increases output in the long run. And you can see, so this is how our model looks at this sort of stuff. And a lot of these plans that have been put forth, they're more than just like broad-based rate cuts. So Kansas is a good example of where just simply going in and cutting taxes and putting in a huge loophole for pass-throughs isn't really the type of tax reform we're looking for. That's just a way to reduce revenue. But instead, looking at more of the structural stuff that we've seen in some of the plans, the full expensing of capital investment, reducing marginal rates while broadening the base, that's the stuff that our model sees as better for the economy in the long run.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
We also think the macro effects are important. There's actually, I'll make a plug for a paper that we just posted on our website by Bill Gale and Andy Samwick, basically looking at historical evidence on how changes in marginal tax rates affect the economy, and what they concluded was that the effects are actually very, very small, and sometimes might even go the wrong way. But of course, the changes we're looking at are different in magnitude from the kinds of changes we're looking at now. It's true that under current budget scoring rules, there would be a dynamic score associated with all of these plans. And Kyle, actually, I think you were the author of the paper that was just posted on?
It was Alan.
Okay, Alan. It's a nice paper on Tax Foundation website on how the economy likely to respond to deficit finance tax cuts. And they point out that the Joint Committee on Taxation and Congressional Budget Office would, actually the way they would score it is the tax cuts would in the short run boost the economy because they're a Keynesian stimulus. They would actually increase demand, but that over time the rising debt would put pressure on interest rates. Interest rates would go up, and one thing we have in our papers is we calculate the marginal effective tax rate on new investment, and from that all of the Republican plans would cut the marginal effective tax rate on new investment. That is, holding interest rates constant, raise the incentive for making new investment. But the interest rate changes that would be consistent with past experience, and there's a nice paper by Bill Gale and Peter Orszag that summarizes the evidence. Based on past experience, interest rates would go up so much because of the rising structural deficits that actually the cost of capital would go up, which means that the interest rate rises would more than offset the effects of lower marginal tax rates. Now, there's a question that's been going on now, and this is discussed in this paper as well. Maybe now it's different. Interest rates are so low that they might just stay there forever. And you can argue about whether this time is different or not. But even if interest rates stay low, if the government accumulated debt at the levels that would be consistent with these tax cuts, even accounting for some small macro feedbacks, the consequence would be eventually that foreign lenders would start viewing the U.S. government as less than perfectly safe investment, and that would push up interest rates. And then you get this really bad dynamic where at the higher interest rate, the debt service cost goes up, so the debt grows even faster, which means interest rates grow even faster, which is what the catastrophic budget failure story is. That's not something we would ever want to experience. So our view is that the long run economic effects of these kinds of deficits, and possibly even much shorter run, would actually be negative. And it's certainly true that the Joint Committee on Taxation would score it that way.
Yeah, generally we agree with that. Like over time, over a long run, the constraint is that revenues have to match spending. And it comes down to, I guess, how credible some of the full fiscal plans are for Republicans. You know, you look at Trump, where they had at one of the last debates, they had just the failure of basic arithmetic that his tax cut is so large, and what he's promising on the spending side really isn't even going to help the current deficit. At that point, you wonder, well, he's going to have to pare back his tax cut, or he's going to have to cut a quarter of federal spending, and that doesn't seem realistic.
And it's not going to touch mandatory spending.
Yeah, so I guess, impossible then. So but generally, like, for small things, and this goes to a good example here, JCT scored bonus depreciation. They scored this as increasing the deficit by about $200 billion over the next decade. Well, when they scored it, and I think their assumption about how closed the economy is or the amount of available saving is little, I think it's a little too closed, that a deficit that small really wouldn't move the needle too much, especially when you're talking about something that increases the incentive to invest going forward. So I think that in that case, it's a little too much of an impact on deficits. But once you get into the trillions range, that's when you have to start wondering. The long run path is not sustainable.
Okay, I'm going to just pull back really quickly for one moment before tossing to the audience. You're not in the business of advocating for any one candidate's plans, but I'm wondering, since nobody's plan ever gets enacted in full or even in part, as tax policy experts, is what one measure from one plan excites you the most that you hope the country talks about whether or not that candidate progresses in the presidential campaign? So just really quickly, one piece from one plan. What excites you the most, Kyle? Why don't you start?
Yeah, no, I think it's excellent that a lot of the Republican plans have the full expensing of capital investment. As I said earlier, one of the biggest issues with the current corporate code is the lengthy depreciation schedules that create this bias against new investment. Full expensing at the corporate level reduces this investment. It gets rid of it. And your tables show, at least, with Rubio's plan, the marginal tax goes to zero, but full expensing is a huge part of that, and I think it's a very important fix and a very important policy to throw out there and start talking about.
Okay, Bob?
Well, that would be the worst thing in any of the plans, in my opinion. But the best thing, I think, probably is Bernie Sanders' proposal to get rid of the deferral of tax on foreign corporate profits, where companies are allowed to pretend to make their money in shoeboxes and savings account holes in Ireland and other small places, and get the corporate income tax to do what it's supposed to do, which is be our main tax on capital in this country. Most capital income is exempt at the personal level, and if you don't tax it at the corporate level, you're never going to tax it at all. Now, I know that would make some people extremely happy, but it doesn't make me happy, because I think that the growing inequality in this country is actually a bad idea, not a good idea.
Okay, Len?
Carbon tax. Bernie Sanders proposes a carbon tax.
It's two for Sanders.
It is.
It is the best carbon tax ever.
It is. It's the only. The thing I really like about Sanders is that he's actually really upfront about new taxes and ways to pay for the government. And carbon tax, I think almost all economists would agree that that's the best way to deal with climate change. It aligns incentives so that basically the price of using fossil fuels and other things reflects the damage that you're doing to the environment. Politically, it's obviously been something most politicians have wanted to stay away from, but there's actually a bipartisan consensus among most economists that this would be the most efficient way and the best way to address climate change.
And he turns what would be a regressive tax into a hugely progressive one while he's at it.
Yeah, and we did account for that because
I know you did.
That was easy to measure.
It certainly is.
So now is your turn to ask a question. There are two people with mics. Yes, two. So please just state your question and let them answer. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ronald Schlesinger, and I'm just a public citizen. I've got a couple of comments that I'd like to address, and maybe you could...
Just a quick question, just because there's a lot of people with
Okay.
questions.
My question is this. Corporations' main goal is maximizing profits, period. So therefore, why do we think that by decreasing corporate taxes, that they will therefore give that extra money to workers, which I don't believe they're going to do?
Who would like to answer that?
So I think you're talking about, if you're,
I don't think any of us necessarily believe that.
you know, I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're talking about something like, you're talking about something like healthcare, that or eliminating payroll taxes or something like that. One thing that economists account for in tax policy is economic incidence. It's just this idea that the entity that's writing the check can be different from the one that's bearing the burden. And Bob talked about the effects of a VAT. And you could have different assumptions about who's going to bear the cost of a value-added tax, but it's certain that it's not just going to be absorbed by sellers, because a lot of them would go bankrupt without raising their prices or cutting wages or other ways of passing it through to others. So corporations don't pay taxes. I mean, the corporations remit taxes to the IRS, but ultimately the burden is borne by investors and by workers or possibly by consumers. So it really depends on the particular proposal, but it does. You do have to try to have an estimate as to who would bear the burden of a tax change.
The lady up front. Oh, sorry.
Mr. Burman and Mr. McIntyre, I want to ask this question. We had in recent years the largest budget deficits in American history. 2009, the deficit was 6.5 times bigger than the largest deficit of the entire Reagan era. Yet during the same period, we've had the lowest interest rates in American history. Has any of that experience led you to change your economic models that you use to analyze the impact of tax reform on revenues and economic growth? And if not, are your models not outdated?
I think it's a great time to fix the bridges.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Larry Summers has made the point that with interest rates really low, this is a good time to invest in infrastructure and do other things. It's the low interest rates have been used as justification for more spending, for more tax cuts. The thing that economists are not good at is predicting turning points. And possibly 20 years from now, we'll have a really good understanding of what was happening to interest rates in the U.S. right now and whether this was some kind of a structural change or something different. My view is that right now there's a lot of capital available on worldwide markets. Europe is not doing well. The Chinese the Chinese are running big surplus. They save a lot more than they spend. For a while, oil countries had a surplus of capital they were using for investing. And even as we have relatively irresponsible fiscal policies, the U.S. government is still seen as a safer investment than anywhere else. There are two things. One is that maybe it's safe to count on Europe staying a basket case forever, but it might not. China is going to be under increasing pressure to make investments in infrastructure, education, other things as their middle class is growing. So they're going to have less capital available to fund our deficits. The oil prices are really low, and they're likely to stay low for a while. So the oil countries' availability of capital is going to decline. Accumulating more and more debt as interest rates stay low puts us at a great risk that interest rates might go up, and then we'd have this kind of vicious debt spiral, or that somebody might decide at some point that we're not the safest investment in the world and move their money very, very quickly somewhere else. And that's a kind of risk that it doesn't seem like it would be prudent to take. But actually modeling it very specifically and making predictions as to when interest rates are going to change or when the debt level is going to become too high, I think that's probably beyond the ability of modern economics.
So I take it your answer is no, you haven't changed your models based on this experience. Is that right? Because you never actually answered my question.
No, we haven't changed our minds.
Okay, there's a woman up front who I'd like to ask the question.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. And to be quite honest, I don't understand most of what you're talking about. I consider myself a continuous learner. The complexity of this is overwhelming. And I guess my real question is there a way you can tell this story visually in graphs that the rest of us could understand what you're saying? I mean, I sort of think we have the least informed voter today. I work very hard to understand what's going on, but you guys all talk in code, and you don't present a picture that most of us can understand, and therefore say this is a better idea than that one. So I'm begging you.
Kyle, do you want to?
We have a picture in the report that we handed out
Yeah, I
today.
was going to say there's a chart here, but I mean,
But it's impossible to read. Due to but online it would be readable.
yeah, and that's the challenge, right? So tax policy is complex in a lot of ways, and the incentives that it creates are complex. So trying to communicate this stuff is a big challenge. And when we put reports together, we try to be as graphic as possible, or put as many graphics in
Trump
there as
supporter.
possible. So it's something that we're attempting, because we think it is important to understand that it does matter how the U.S. raises tax revenue.
Yeah, we have some graphical depictions of, and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has they do a really good job of presenting things graphically. And then smart reporters like Jeanne, who's among the very best, do a really good job of translating our fairly detailed analyses in terms that real people can understand. But it's a big challenge. We try to figure out ways to make things as clear as possible. And I guess we got kind of worked up about our debates here. We maybe geeked out a little bit too much. But you're right that it's important to make it as clear.
And it's a matter compared to what?
Mhm.
I mean, it's not just this story, but what would be the implications depending upon which path we chose?
Gentleman over there.
My name is David Hoffman, and I do some work with Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign. My question is for the entire panel, but especially Bob McIntyre. Here's the question. Several economists, Gerald Friedman at UMass Amherst, Jamie Galbraith at Texas Austin, a number of these economists, who are basically neo-Keynesian, of course, argue that the Sanders budget overall, taxes and spending, would, because of the Great Recession and the vastly underutilized resources, and that the net effect of the Sanders overall program would be to spur economic growth remarkably, and that it would generate broadly growth gains, and especially for the middle class, income gains, and the tax effects especially would benefit the middle class and the poor, with the kind of health care as well that Bob McIntyre has spoken of. To crystallize the question then, does the Friedman and Galbraith and many other economists do the assumptions about spurring economic growth, do they make sense?
I take great pride in not being an economist. I'm a lawyer, which means I pay attention to detail in the real world and don't assume things as much. But I would think that in a time when the country's infrastructure, for example, has fallen apart, that this is a great time, low interest rates, and that the government should be investing very heavily in that. We're seeing what's happening right here in Washington with the Memorial Bridge from lack of maintenance. So these are investments. These aren't just spending the money. These are saving the money in the long run. You know, the old oil filter ad, oh God, nobody remembers it, but pay me now or pay me later. Well, we could do some pay me nows here and save a lot of money in the long run, and I think that would be great for the economy. Will a health plan be great for the economy? Well, it'll sure make people feel a lot better. And that, you know, consumer confidence and all is important. I know from dealing with my daughter, for instance, that she just had a baby. I'm a grandfather, first time. Ha! the insurance issue she has, you know, she's got a job, she may have to leave the job. Her husband has health insurance, but it's really expensive to get another one, and you shop around for it, and it is so stressful. And that's true for so many people in this country, you know. You have this thing, maybe you're on Medicaid, and then you marry somebody, and now you're not, but his insurance it costs too much to pay for you. That's my daughter again. Anyway, I think that actually could have just a sort of wonderful effect of making people feel better, which might make them more confident, and then we could get all these people who are spending their time trying to not let people get insurance coverage go out and do some useful work, which might help too.
Okay, this gentleman in the second row. There's a mic.
Market economist. I've spent 2 days at the NABE conference, policy conference here in Washington on Monday and Tuesday. And one of the striking presentations was by Keith Hall, director of the CBO. And of course, one of the most contentious assumptions of the CBO over the last few years has been potential growth. And it's critical to understand your forecast of the decline in revenues or increase in revenues projected for each of the candidates' programs to understand what your assumptions are for growth and inflation over that 10-year period. If you're assuming 2% growth and continued low productivity, then that says one thing about your assumptions. If you're assuming a rise back to 3% growth, then that changes your assumptions and outlook a great deal.
In my case, I just followed the CBO projections, so I didn't have to think.
We do as well.
Yeah, for static revenue assumptions, it's just whatever's in the CBO baseline. And for dynamic, we're looking at sort of this comparative statics world where output is different in the future based on the tax changes, and that's again based off of what the CBO already thinks is out there.
We have time for one or two more questions. Is that Mark? This is your event. What?
Well,
Okay,
I wanted to follow up on that question about
Mark.
I wanted to follow up about that question on the Friedman analysis. Could all of you speak to what levels of economic growth you think are and aren't attainable by tax policy and other means, and whether candidates might be overpromising? It's a leading question.
So, I mean, our evaluation of past evidence is that taxes probably don't have a tremendous effect on economic growth. Now, again, some of these changes are so big that they're outside of past experience. Frankly, I think it's a good thing that the economy isn't as sensitive to taxes as some people think, because if it were and you actually needed to have a good tax system for the economy to grow, we would have been in a depression for the last 100 years.
Oh, it's not that bad.
Kyle, do you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think that looking at past experiences is useful, but there are limits because some of the changes that we're seeing are outside the bounds of what we've seen. Like a lot of these plans are cutting the corporate tax significantly. They're allowing the expensing of investment. They're eliminating the double tax on corporate income. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. And the amount of growth, again, comes down to what we can expect on the spending side as well.
Do you think the candidates are overpromising, though?
Well, we're not entirely sure what they're doing on the spending side.
Okay.
So
We just know it's awful.
We're not entirely sure. Sometimes it's just a little easier to promise on the tax side than it is on the spending side if there's an offset there. So.
And Kyle made an important point, which is that what you do on the spending side can also affect economic growth beyond, the Keynesian short-term effects. And I think it's certainly right that if we significantly increase spending in the short term, there would be a boost until the economy got up to full capacity. But there's some spending that's in the nature of investments, as Bob said. There's others that's more consumption.
Consumption is good.
It is good, but it doesn't boost the economy.
Well, yes, it does.
When it's at full employment.
Yeah, just one last
produces
question.
inflationary pressure.
The man in the back.
I would just say, one, I'm a big fan of CRFB. I'm on your mailing list. That's the only reason I'm here. So thank you for your work. Like in the debates, there's one candidate who's not getting any attention. And one of the reasons I did come, because there's one candidate who's touting that he's the only one who's actually produced a federal balanced budget. Mm-hmm. He's also touting tax cuts and a federal balanced budget. So I want to hear from CRFB, the veracity on that. Is that a case?
I would love to answer that question.
Okay.
In 1997, the United States Congress passed a bill called the Balanced Budget Act. It was a great name, but it was a little bit off. The budget was balanced before the bill was passed. John Kasich had nothing to do with balancing the federal budget. However, he did have something to do with reducing the surpluses, because the balanced budget bill was a collection of tax cuts, largely for the rich, and phony baloney Medicare cuts. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the doc fix, where they passed this law in 1997 that doctors were going to get paid a lot less. And then they put it off for a year. And then they put it off for another year. And finally, by the time they said that maybe we should do it, they had to cut doctors' pay by 35% because it was cumulative. Well, we can't do that, so they finally repealed it. Anyway, so John Kasich helped balance the budget? No. John Kasich was against balancing the budget in reality, no matter what he said in rhetoric. But they did not. Everybody knows this. You can ask anybody who was there. You can ask the Congressional Budget Office. Budget was balanced before. Why was it balanced? Because Clinton raised taxes on the rich. And, to be fair, George Herbert Walker Bush cut spending. But the two of those together balanced the budget. Not capital gains tax cuts and a $500 credit for children.
Well, the other thing is there's not enough detail from Governor Kasich about what his plan would do. That's actually one way in which he's an outlier. So, we'd be happy to analyze his plan if we knew what it was, but I don't think anybody does.
Yeah, and
based on past experience, we know. Say one thing and do the other.
The basic outline looks a lot like Jeb's plan. So it looks like he is attempting to reduce revenues. So it's but he has a lot of the same structural stuff as Jeb as well. So.
And would you say Jeb Bush put out the most comprehensive tax proposal of all the candidates, or was it? He was the earliest.
It was a really interesting proposal. It was very, very well thought out, but again, the numbers didn't add up. It would have, before accounting for macroeconomic effects, it would have also increased deficits by about $7 trillion over the next decade.
Okay. We have to leave it there because one short question. Senator.
You mentioned the carbon tax. How are you going to equalize it?
Equalize it in what sense?
Well, everybody doesn't have the availability because they depend on one type of energy, and you're going to put a carbon tax on everybody?
Well, so
what about the people that, say, get hydro benefits?
Well, so the point is you actually want to move people to getting hydro benefits if you believe that using fossil fuels is damaging the environment. Basically, you don't want to equalize it. You want it on really carbon-intensive products or fuels. You want to have a high tax, and on ones that don't use carbon, you want low tax or zero tax.
That isn't going to work.
Well, it works economically. It might not work politically.
Sure. So you're going to penalize the individual that has no other source of energy.
Well, I mean, actually, you can build in subsidies to make it, and actually, Sanders has a plan that would rebate the carbon tax to most people. The point. Okay.
Okay. I think we have to bring it to a close. Thank you to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget for holding the event, and very great thanks to the panelists for bringing their intelligence in.